Let me tell you something, boss. If you've never stood in the corridors of a state asylum at 2 in the morning, you don't know what real dark is. It ain't just the absence of light. It's a heavy, breathing kind of blackness that smells like stale floor wax, chemical sedatives, and 70 years of forgotten screams soaked straight into the plaster walls. The year was 1974. I was 28, and while guys my age were home in bed with their wives, I was pulling the midnight to 6 shift at Blackwood State Hospital, way out in rural Illinois. My job wasn't prestigious, boss. I wasn't a doctor, and I wasn't a nurse. I was the gurney pusher. Whenever one of the chronically ill patients up on the 4th floor surgical ward finally gave up the ghost, they'd call me. I'd haul my 80-pound, rusted iron gurney out of the basement elevator, roll it into the operating room, slide the cold meat onto the zinc frame, and cover it with a stiff, bleached white sheet. Then came the hard part, pushing that heavy iron rig through 3 miles of subterranean concrete ramps and narrow, yellow-lit hallways all the way down to the holding coolers in the sub-basement. The gurney was an ancient piece of industrial junk from the 1940s, boss. The frame was solid, pitted iron, and the 4 small caster wheels were completely stripped of their rubber. Every time I took a corner, those wheels would let out a high-pitched, metallic screech and a harsh rhythmic clucking that echoed through the empty wards like a circular saw hitting a bone. Just 4 more hours, Arthur, I muttered to myself, checking my brass wristwatch under the dim, buzzing fluorescent bulb of the elevator. The heavy iron gate of the elevator gave a dull chime and slid open at the 4th floor. The air up there was freezing, boss. The hospital kept the heat off in the west wing to save on coal, and the damp humidity coming off the brickwork turned my breath into a thick, gray cloud before it even left my lips. Waiting for me on the steel prep table of operating room 3 was case number 812. The chart hanging from the toe tag said his name was Donald Vance. He'd spent 40 years locked in a rubber-lined cell on the maximum security ward before his heart finally gave out during an experimental hydrotherapy session. His skin had that distinct, waterlogged, marble gray tint, and his eyes were open, staring blankly at the frosted glass skylight above. I grabbed him by the stiff canvas shroud, dragged his cold, dead weight onto my iron gurney, and flipped the white sheet over his face. The iron wheels screamed against the floor as I pushed the gurney out into the dark, narrow hallway, aiming for the long concrete ramp that led down to the coolers. The silence of the asylum closed in behind me like wet cement. But as I hit the first downward slope, I noticed something off, boss. The gurney didn't want to roll. Donald Vance couldn't have weighed more than 140 pounds soaking wet. But as the iron wheels hit the concrete incline, the frame suddenly dropped 2 inches, the iron axles groaning under a massive, invisible pressure. It felt like someone had just jumped onto the back of the rig, pressing their boots down onto the steel frame with everything they had. I gritted my teeth, dug the heels of my work boots into the concrete, and shoved the gurney forward, forcing the metal to grind along the floorboards. At the end of the corridor, right where the ramp made a sharp, 90-degree turn into the basement tunnels, the hospital had mounted a large, circular, concave safety mirror, one of those old, distorted glass bubbles used to see around blind corners. I kept my head down, pushing through the heavy static of the air. But as the screaming wheels approached the turn, my eyes naturally darted up to that curved mirror to check the clearance. My heart stopped dead in my chest, boss. In the distorted reflection of the glass, the white sheet wasn't flat anymore. Donald Vance was sitting upright on the iron gurney. His head was cocked at a sickening, 90-degree angle, his waxy, gray hands gripping the edges of the metal frame right behind my shoulders, and his hollow, dead eyes were staring straight into the back of my skull. I whipped my head around so fast my neck popped, boss. The movement was pure instinct, a desperate reflex to face the horror clawing at the back of my mind. My work boots skidded on the greasy floorboards, my hands locking onto the rusted handlebar of the gurney as I braced for a struggle. But there was nothing. The long corridor was completely still under the pale, buzzing fluorescent lights. On the zinc frame, the white cotton sheet lay perfectly flat over Donald Vance's body. The sharp, rigid outlines of his nose, his chin, and his frozen toes were exactly where they were supposed to be, unmoving beneath the bleached cloth. The only thing stirring in that narrow hallway was my own heavy breath, turning to gray soot in the damp chill of the west wing. I stood there for 20 seconds, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, waiting for the cloth to twitch. It didn't. "Get a grip, Arthur," I whispered, the sound of my own voice flat and small against the cold plaster walls. "You've been looking at too many charts. The shadows in those concave mirrors are warped. It's just an optical illusion. Medical workers see things when the fatigue hits them at 3 in the morning, boss. The brain takes the curve of a wall, the reflection of a light bulb, and the silhouette of a corpse, and it stitches them together into a nightmare. That's what I told myself. That's the lie I needed to believe to keep my boots moving. I turned back around, gripped the cold iron handlebar, and shoved the gurney into the 90-degree turn. The metal caster wheels let out a prolonged, piercing screech that bounced off the brick walls, a dry, ungreased groan that felt like it was drilling straight into my skull. The sound died down to a rhythmic, heavy thudding as I hit the long subterranean ramp leading into the sub-basement tunnels. This was the oldest part of Blackwood, boss. Built in the late 1890s, the walls down here weren't smooth plaster, they were heavy, rough-cut river stone, constantly weeping a thick, black moisture that smelled like coal dust and old vinegar. The air temperature dropped 10 degrees in the span of 30 feet, turning the humidity into a freezing, invisible fog that stuck to my wool shirt. And then, the resistance came back. We were on a downward slope, boss. The gurney should have been running away from me, forcing me to pull back on the handle to keep it from racing down the concrete incline. But it wasn't running. It was stopping. With every step I took, the iron rig got heavier. It felt like I was pushing a delivery truck through wet sand. My thigh muscles burned, and my boots began to slip against the wet concrete as I forced my weight against the handlebar. The iron axles gave a low, metallic groan under the stress, the metal frame dropping another inch closer to the floor. It wasn't Donald Vance's 140-pound frame doing that. The weight was accumulating, multiplying with every foot we moved deeper into the earth, as if the very air inside the tunnel was condensing into solid lead on top of the zinc table. I stopped, my breath coming in ragged, whistling gasps. I wiped the freezing sweat from my forehead with the back of my sleeve, my eyes locked on the white sheet. The cloth was taut now. It wasn't loose or draped over his limbs anymore. The linen was stretched so tight across his chest that the fibers were humming with a faint, high-frequency vibration, like a guitar string tuned past its breaking point. From beneath the sheet, a sound began to form. It wasn't a voice, not yet. It was a wet, rhythmic rustling, the sound of heavy canvas sliding slowly against a dry, rough surface. It matched the exact pace of my own breathing. Every time I drew a breath of that freezing, carbolic air, the sheet would pucker and sink in the center, as if a pair of hollow, invisible lungs beneath the cotton were drawing the atmosphere out of the tunnel. I reached out with a trembling, numb hand, my fingers hovering an inch above the border of the shroud. I wanted to pull it back. I wanted to prove to myself that Donald Vance was still dead, that his eyes were still closed, and that the cold meat wasn't shifting under the linen. The moment my knuckles brushed the edge of the cloth, a shock of absolute, administrative cold shot straight up my arm, so violent it made my elbow lock. The gurney gave a sudden, sharp jerk forward, the metal wheels grinding against the concrete without me even touching the handle. It didn't roll down the slope, boss, it was yanked. Something from the dark at the bottom of the ramp had just grabbed the front axle and pulled. The sudden, violent jerk threw me off balance, boss. My boots slid out from under me on the wet concrete, and my chin clipped the rusted edge of the handlebar with a dull, heavy click that sent a sharp bolt of pain through my jaw. I went down on one knee, my hands scrambling for a grip in the greasy slime coating the floorboards of the ramp. The gurney rolled 5 feet down the dark incline, then stopped dead with a heavy, metallic thud. It didn't drift or coast to a halt like a wheeled cart should. It hit an invisible wall, the 4 iron caster wheels locking instantly, their ungreased axles giving off a low, vibrating hum that resonated straight through the stone walls of the tunnel. "Who's down there?" I called out, my voice sounding thin, cracked, and completely swallowed by the dense, carbolic air. No one answered. The only response was the steady, rhythmic dripping of groundwater from the overhead pipes, each drop hitting the concrete like a tiny hammer against an anvil. I dragged myself back up to my feet, my bad knee popping under the strain. The freezing humidity had thickened into a heavy, white ground fog that swirled around my ankles, drawn toward the front of the gurney by a faint, whistling draft. I limped down the slope until I was standing right behind the handlebar again, my eyes wide and unblinking in the yellow gloom. The white sheet covering Donald Vance was no longer flat, boss. The cotton shroud had been pulled taut toward the front of the rig, the fabric bunched up around his neck as if an unseen hand had grabbed him by the throat and yanked him forward. Under the dim, buzzing light of the wall fixture, I could see the sharp, angular contours of his skull pressing against the linen from the inside out. He wasn't lying down anymore. His upper spine was locked in a rigid, 45-degree angle, his head suspended 3 inches off the zinc table without any physical support. And then, the weight of the room changed. The air pressure dropped instantly, hitting my eardrums with a sickening, pneumatic pop that made my head spin. Every time I tried to draw a breath, the oxygen felt dry and restricted, smelling heavily of scorched copper, old hydrotherapy tubs, and wet wool. From beneath the zinc frame of the gurney, a wet, rhythmic sound began to rise. It wasn't the screech of the wheels this time, boss. It was a pressurized, dual-pulsed thudding that came directly from the center of the iron axles, a heavy, mechanical cadence that sounded like a steam piston operating inside a closed vault. Asterisk thumpshuck. Thumpshuck, asterisk. With every dual pulse of that rhythm, the gurney sank another half-inch closer to the floor. The solid iron frame was groaning under an immense, accumulating gravity, the metal bowing slightly in the center as if 1,000 pounds of wet sand had been dropped onto Donald Vance's chest. I reached for the handlebar, my fingers numb and white as I tried to pull the rig backward, up the ramp, away from the sub-basement tunnels. I couldn't move it an inch. The gurney was anchored to the concrete by an impossible hydraulic pull. Suddenly, the white sheet over Donald Vance's face began to move. It didn't twitch or blow in the draft. The cotton fabric began to sink into the hollows of his mouth and eye sockets, drawn inward by a sudden, violent vacuum underneath the cloth. The blue, waxy outlines of his lips became visible through the bleached linen, stretching wide, wider than any human jaw should ever open, until the fabric itself began to tear with a dry, thread-snapping sound. From the dark cavity beneath the split shroud, a voice erupted. It wasn't Donald Vance's voice, boss. It was a collective, multi-layered rattle, the sound of dozens of distinct, frantic throats all speaking in a synchronized, flat cadence that filled the narrow tunnel until the river stones themselves began to vibrate. "Arthur," the choir of the dead scraped out through the wet cloth. Asterisk, the pressure is building in the lower tanks. You left the valve closed. Push the rig to the cooler, Arthur. We want in. Asterisk. The collective roar from the split linen shroud didn't just shake the air, boss, it hit my chest like a physical blow, knocking the breath clean out of my lungs. The multiple voices hidden inside Donald Vance's throat were dry, flat, and perfectly synchronized, sounding like a choir of people who had drowned in cold water years ago but were still trying to scream through a mouthful of silt. I backed away 2 steps, my boots slipping on the greasy concrete of the ramp. My hands were shaking so violently I couldn't even ball them into fists. "Get back in the ground," I choked out, my voice sounding like a whisper against the industrial rattle of the tunnel. "You're dead, Vance. Case 812 is closed." The entity inside the meat didn't care about the ledger, boss. The heavy iron gurney gave another sudden, jointed shudder, and the 4 stripped caster wheels began to turn on their own. They didn't spin smoothly, they ground against the concrete with a prolonged, metallic screech that sounded like a saw blade hitting an iron spike. The rig started rolling down the steep incline toward the sub-basement tunnels, moving at a slow, deliberate walking pace that perfectly matched my own retreating steps. Asterisk thump shuck. Thump shuck, asterisk. The mechanical rhythm inside the axles was picking up speed, matching the frantic hammering of my heart. With every dual pulse of that invisible piston, a thick, silver-gray moisture began to bleed directly out of the rough-cut river stones of the walls. It wasn't water. It was a dense, alkaline condensation that smelled heavily of boiled starch, carbolic wash, and old wet wool, pooling across the floorboards in perfectly straight, geometric lines that ran right over my boots. The cold that followed wasn't just a drop in temperature, boss. It was a predatory vacuum. It sucked the warmth right out of my clothes, turning my wool shirt into a stiff, freezing layer that stuck to my back like sheet ice. I looked up at the wall fixtures. The dim, buzzing fluorescent bulbs were starting to fail, the light shrinking down to small, violet beads that drowned in the sudden, pressurized humidity of the tunnel. The glass covers over the bulbs were frosting over from the center outward, forming the unmistakable, geometric outlines of 5-fingered hands pressing against the glass from the inside out. Donald Vance's body was sitting completely upright on the zinc table now, his spine locked at that sickening, 90-degree angle. The white sheet covering his head had split wide open down the middle, the torn borders of the cotton peeling back to reveal his waterlogged, marble-gray face. His jaw was unhinged, hanging open 3 inches lower than a living man's could go, exposing a dark, empty cavity that was lined with a faint, phosphorescent silver light. He wasn't looking at the ceiling anymore, boss. His head gave a sharp, mechanical click to the left, his frozen, clouded pupils locking straight onto my face. The long, loose corners of the torn shroud began to whip through the air. They weren't drifting in a draft. They were rigid as iron wires, spinning in tiny, rapid circles that made a high-pitched, drilling hiss through the dark like an industrial sewing machine operating at maximum speed in a closed vault. The waxy white outlines of dozens of shifting faces began to fold over and over into themselves within the open cavity of his mouth, their features appearing for a fraction of a second before being crushed back into the pressurized mass of the gray vapor. They were drawing the very atmosphere out of the tunnel, forcing it into the dark throat of Case 812 to complete the circuit. I knew if that gurney hit the bottom of the ramp at that speed, it would crash straight through the iron safety gates of the holding coolers, breaking the seal on every dead unit in the hospital. I lunged forward through the silver fog, my raw hands grabbing the cold iron handlebar of the gurney with everything I had left. I threw my entire weight backward, digging the heels of my work boots into the concrete, trying to act as a human brake against the hydraulic force dragging us into the dark. The iron gave a loud, metallic snap under the sudden tension, and the front axle flared with a sharp burst of blue static that tasted like raw copper on my tongue. The blue static flash didn't just blind me, boss, it hit the nerves in my hands like a direct line from an ungrounded generator. A sharp, copper taste flooded my mouth, and my forearms locked up into rigid knots as the kinetic current raced up my sleeves. But I didn't let go of that iron handlebar. If I let go, that 80-pound carriage was going to rocket down the final incline and splinter itself against the sub-basement bulkhead. My work boots didn't find a grip. They skated across the silver-gray alkaline condensation pooling on the concrete, leaving 2 dark, parallel tracks in the grease as the sheer momentum of the gurney dragged me along behind it. The wait was impossible now. It wasn't just case number 812 on that zinc frame anymore, it felt like I was trying to single-handedly hold back a runaway coal car in a collapsed mine shaft. The iron axles beneath the table were groaning under a heavy, hydraulic strain, the metal structural rods bending downward until they were barely an inch above the floorboards. Asterisk thump shuck. Thump shuck, asterisk. The dual-pulsed piston rhythm inside the wheels exploded in volume, turning into a deafening, industrial roar that echoed through the narrow Riverstone tunnel. The air pressure dropped so low my nose began to bleed, a warm, thick drop of red hitting my collar before instantly freezing into a stiff, dark bead in the administrative cold of the ramp. Hold! I screamed, my voice instantly swallowed by the dense, pressurized atmosphere. You ain't going down to the coolers, Vance. Not like this. Donald Vance's marble-gray torso didn't move, but the torn edges of the white shroud around his neck were whipping through the freezing fog like steel cables. One of those rigid linen strands snapped across my cheek, cutting the skin with a clean, razor-sharp edge that didn't bleed. The cold was so immediate it sealed the wound with frost before the blood could even form. Through the silver mist, I could see the bottom of the incline just 30 feet away. The dim, violet beads of the failing fluorescent bulbs cast long, geometric shadows that bent at unnatural angles across the rough masonry. Right at the base of the ramp stood the heavy, double-leaf oak doors that led into the sub-basement hallway, the final barrier before the morgue holding coolers. The doors were locked from the inside with a massive, 3-inch brass deadbolt. If we hit them at this speed, the iron frame of the gurney would act as a pneumatic ram, fracturing the wood and breaching the entire lower wing. With a sudden, desperate surge of adrenaline, I didn't try to pull back on the handlebar anymore. I shifted my weight, throwing my entire torso over the rear frame of the gurney. I jammed my right work boot directly between the solid iron chassis and the left rear caster wheel, using the thick rubber sole of my own shoe as a manual brake pad. The friction was instantaneous and violent. The smell of scorched rubber and burnt leather filled the tunnel, mixing with the stale carbolic wash and the odor of wet wool. A massive shower of freezing blue sparks erupted from the locked wheel, stinging my ankles and biting through my denim trousers. The gurney gave a violent, jointed lurch to the left, the iron frame spinning 45 degrees and slamming hard against the rough river stone wall of the tunnel. The impact was concussive. The masonry cracked, raining chunks of ancient mortar down onto the zinc table, but the momentum was broken. The screeching of the wheels died down to a low, vibrating hum as the carriage ground to a halt, pinned sideways across the narrow ramp. I fell backward into the slush, my right boot smoking from the heat, my breath coming in ragged, whistling gasps that turned to instant soot in the air. But before I could even drag myself up, the unhinged jaw of Donald Vance clicked another notch to the left. The phosphorescent silver light inside his open throat flared into a brilliant, drilling glare, and the silver-gray fluid on the floor began to reverse its flow, rising up the legs of the gurney like a column of mercury. The reversal of the fluid wasn't a slow trickle, boss. It was a sudden, anti-gravitational pull that made the hairs on my arms stand up like wire brush bristles. The silver-gray alkaline condensation didn't pool around the iron caster wheels anymore, it crawled up the rusted legs of the gurney in thick, geometric veins, defying every law of physics as it coated the zinc frame in a dull, metallic sheen. I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, my smoking right boot slipping against the frozen slime of the concrete ramp. Every breath I drew felt like I was inhaling crushed glass. The administrative cold had settled deep into my sternum, compressing my lungs until my ribs throbbed with that same heavy, dual-pulsed industrial cadence. Asterisk thump shuck. Thump shuck, asterisk. Donald Vance's unhinged jaw remained locked open, the phosphorescent silver glare from his throat casting long, skeletal shadows of the gurney's rails against the stone ceiling joists. From that dark, empty cavity, the choir of the dead started up again, but the flat, synchronized tone had turned sharp and erratic, like a steam whistle being forced past its structural safety threshold. "Arthur," the voices vibrated straight through the concrete beneath my palms, rattling the marrow in my bones. Asterisk, the return line is dry. The pressure in the fourth floor ward has no ground. You're holding the circuit open, Artie. Let the carriage drop. Asterisk. I ain't letting nothing drop, I growled through my chattering teeth, my voice dry as paper in the freezing vault of the tunnel. I reached out into the dark, my bleeding fingers searching the slush for anything to use as a wedge. My hand closed around a heavy, 9-inch iron alignment pin that had shaken loose from the wall's pipe brackets during the impact. It was pitted with rust, sub-zero cold, and heavy enough to crack a skull. Above me, the gurney began to shake. The immense pneumatic pressure building from the upper wards was venting straight down through the dead meat of case 812. The force was lifting the front two wheels of the 80-pound carriage clear off the concrete incline, suspending the iron chassis in mid-air at an impossible, jointed angle. The long, rigid strands of the split white sheet were spinning so fast now they were nothing but a gray blur, making a high-pitched, drilling hiss that sounded like a textile loom gone completely off the tracks. One of the tendrils lashed out, striking the river stone wall behind me and shearing off a 2-inch chunk of ancient masonry with a sharp, static crackle. The wire-like linen was aligning itself, pointing straight at my collarbone to bridge the gap and drive the potential of that 1974 failure straight into my central nervous system. If that thread touched me, boss, the circuit would complete. The pressure wouldn't just disintegrate the corpse, it would ground the entire atmospheric weight of Blackwood's dead directly through my boots. I didn't try to pull away from the gurney. I used the slope, throwing my torso forward into the freezing silver fog. I wedged the heavy iron alignment pin directly into the narrow teeth of the rear axle gear, using both hands to create a manual lock. At that exact second, my eyes caught the large, circular concave safety mirror mounted in the corner above the turn. In the curved glass, the distortion was gone. The reflection was crystal clear, showing the entity for what it really was, a massive, pressurized column of white, braided vapor that extended from Donald Vance's open chest all the way up through the concrete ceiling to the operating rooms above. I didn't strike the gurney. I reached up with the iron pin and smashed the solid metal end straight into the center of that curved glass bubble. The mirror didn't just crack, it shattered with a concussive, pressurized roar that sounded like a boiler header exploding. The silvered glass fragments rained down onto the zinc table in a blinding shower of sharp, blue-tinged shards. The effect on the room was instantaneous and violent. The sudden destruction of the reflection fractured the geometric lines of the entity. The silver-gray fluid climbing the gurney's legs instantly lost its tension, splashing back down onto the floorboards like ordinary water as the vacuum pressure violently reversed to equalize the room. The front wheels of the carriage slammed back onto the concrete with a heavy, metallic clang that vibrated through my boots. The rigid, wire-like linen threads went limp, dropping across Donald Vance's marble-gray face like ordinary, wet cloth. The roaring static in my ears died down to a low, rhythmic whistling as the external air from the upper elevator shafts began to rush down the ramp to fill the void. I lay there in the cold dust, my chest heaving, listening to the normal, hollow echo of the asylum returning to the dark. The silence that followed the shattering of the mirror wasn't peaceful, boss. It was that heavy, clogged quiet that plugs your ears right after a lightning strike. The air pressure in the tunnel equalized with a final, wet gasp, leaving a thick scent of old plaster and burnt rubber hanging in the freezing dampness. I sat there in the slush for a good 2 minutes, my hands still locked around that iron alignment pin, waiting for the gurney to twitch. My right boot was ruined, the sole half melted from the friction brake I'd forced against the wheel, but the white-hot pain in my knee meant I was still on this side of the dirt. Slowly, I dragged myself up using the river stone wall for leverage. Donald Vance lay flat on the zinc frame again. His spine had settled back into its natural, heavy post-mortem state, and his head had rolled to the side, no longer clicking in my direction. The unhinged jaw had closed, leaving his gray lips parted in an ordinary, empty stare. The phosphorescent silver glare was entirely gone, replaced by the dull, yellow glare of the single surviving bulb at the top of the ramp. "The line is clear," I muttered, my voice sounding like gravel. I kicked the iron alignment pin out of the rear axle gear. The gurney didn't move on its own anymore. It was just 80 pounds of dead weight and pitted iron again. I grabbed the cold handlebar, gritted my teeth against the tear in my knee, and began to guide the carriage down the last 10 feet of the incline. Without the hydraulic pull, the wheels didn't scream. They just gave a low, ungreased groan that echoed down the lower hallway as I pushed through the heavy oak doors. This was the sub-basement corridor, boss, the deepest trench of Blackwood. The floor here was poured concrete, stained dark by decades of coal soot and chemical runoff from the old boiler room next door. The walls were lined with thick, insulated iron pipes that carried the municipal water lines and the return steam from the laundry facility on the opposite side of the grounds. Every light down here was dead. The only illumination came from the small, red exit sign hanging over the far end of the hall, casting a long, crimson track across the wet concrete. I pushed the gurney toward the holding coolers, the rhythmic thudding of my ruined boot matching the slow dripping of the overhead pipes. But as I drew closer to the big steel refrigerator doors, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The concrete floor beneath my feet was dry, boss. Bone dry. But the air temperature was rising. It wasn't a warm, comfortable heat. It was a suffocating, greasy humidity that smelled of sulfur and old laundry vats. The thick insulation wrapped around the steam return pipes began to hiss, tiny plumes of white vapor escaping from the seams like needles pushing through cloth. I checked my brass wristwatch. The hands hadn't moved since the mirror broke. They were locked right at 2:40 a.m. Suddenly, the red exit light ahead gave a sharp, metallic pop and went dark, plunging the entire corridor into an absolute, pitch-black void. Behind me, the heavy oak doors of the ramp didn't just swing shut, boss. They slammed together with a concussive force that rattled the iron pipes in their brackets, and the distinct, heavy click of a brass deadbolt sliding into place echoed through the dark. I was locked in the trench. And from the interior of the walls, the rhythmic piston sound started up again, not from the gurney this time, but from the very pipes surrounding me. The darkness that hit the hallway wasn't just an absence of light, boss, it was a physical weight that pressed against my eyeballs, thick and grease-heavy. I stood frozen behind the gurney, my fingers digging into the cold iron handlebar until my knuckles cracked. The air temperature was climbing by the second, turning the freezing draft from the ramp into a sweltering, carbolic steam bath that made my wool shirt stick to my ribs like wet leather. I reached out blindly with my right hand, tracing the damp, insulated canvas of the steam pipe along the wall to find my bearings. The fabric was vibrating, humming like a live high-voltage wire under a massive, unvented load. Asterisk thumpshuck. Thumpshuck, asterisk. The mechanical piston rhythm was deeper now, shaking the concrete floorboards beneath my boots. It wasn't coming from the gurney anymore, boss. The sound was moving inside the walls, rolling through the network of old iron plumbing that connected the sub-basement to the entire fourth-floor ward. Arthur. The voice didn't come from Donald Vance this time. It rattled directly out of the brass safety valve of the main steam return line above my head. It was Uncle Silas's tobacco-shredded rasp, but it was layered with that same flat, multi-throated choir I'd heard on the ramp. Asterisk, the gate is shut, Artie. The whole circuit is backing up from the top floor. You can't park the carriage here. The coolers are the only ground left. Asterisk. I didn't answer. I reached into my pocket, my numb fingers searching for my heavy iron flashlight. I flicked the brass switch, but the bulb didn't throw a beam. It just gave off a weak, dying orange thread that didn't penetrate the dark 3 inches past the lens. Under that dull amber glow, I could see the insulated pipes weeping a dark, yellowish grease that sizzled as it hit the hot iron fittings. I pushed the gurney forward, using the wall as a guide, my ruined boot dragging with a heavy, rhythmic scrape against the concrete. The carriage felt light now, boss, dangerously light. When I pressed my hand down on the zinc frame, Donald Vance's body didn't have any weight to it at all. It felt like pushing an empty canvas basket. The density had completely left the meat, drawn out by the immense vacuum pressure that was currently expanding inside the iron plumbing around me. I reached the end of the corridor where the holding coolers stood. In the weak orange thread of my flashlight, the massive, stainless steel refrigerator doors looked like the hull of a submarine. The hospital used the old industrial latch system from the 50s, a heavy, chrome-plated lever that dropped into a solid iron tooth to seal the vault shut. There were 12 individual body drawers inside, stacked 3 high, behind a central 4-inch insulated seal. I reached out, grabbed the cold chrome lever of cooler number 3, and threw my weight upward to break the vacuum. The handle didn't budge, boss. It was frozen solid, not with ice, but with a thick, crystallized layer of that same silver-gray alkaline rust I'd seen on the ramp mirror. The metal skin of the refrigerator door was vibrating in absolute synchronization with the pipes, giving off a low, drilling hum that made my teeth ache in their sockets. Behind me, the gurney gave a sudden, sharp rattle. I didn't even look back, boss. I knew what it was. Without me touching the handlebar, the iron caster wheels began to spin against the dry concrete, turning the carriage around until the front axle was pointed straight at the center of my spine. The white sheet didn't rise this time. It began to sink down into the zinc frame, the cotton fibers being sucked through the drainage slats of the table as if a massive, hydraulic piston was pulling Donald Vance down into the very foundation of the building. The chrome lever beneath my hands gave a violent, metallic click and dropped on its own, the heavy steel door of the cooler swinging inward with a deep, ungreased groan that swallowed the room. The opening of cooler number 3 didn't vent cold air into the hallway, boss. It was a vacuum. A massive, freezing draft rushed inward, dragging the greasy carbolic steam straight into the black mouth of the refrigerator vault with a loud, whistling hiss. The suction was so violent it yanked my hands right off the chrome lever. My boots skidded on the dry concrete as the air density in the corridor plummeted, making my eardrums pop with a sharp, sickening click. In the dying, orange thread of my flashlight, the interior of the cooler wasn't just a row of empty steel trays. The deep, 12-drawer vault was lined with the same rough-cut river stone as the oldest tunnels, and every single inch of the masonry was sweating that thick, silver-gray alkaline fluid. It dripped from the iron ceiling braces in heavy, geometric drops that didn't hit the floorboards, they vanished into the dark before they could land. Asterisk thump shuck. Thump shuck, asterisk. The industrial piston rhythm inside the walls stopped dead. The sudden silence was deafening, boss. Every pipe in the corridor went rigid, the hissing steam valves snapping shut in absolute unison. The only sound left was the slow, rhythmic scraping of the iron caster wheels behind me as the gurney began to move on its own. I didn't turn around. I could see the reflection of the hallway in the polished stainless steel of the open cooler door. The gurney was tracking straight for me, its rusted axles perfectly aligned. But Donald Vance wasn't on the zinc table anymore, boss. The white cotton sheet was completely flat, sucked clean through the drainage slats of the frame like a piece of old gauze. The carriage was empty, but the iron frame was riding so low the bottom brackets were scraping the concrete, sparking with that same freezing blue static that tasted like raw copper. Something invisible was standing on that rig, pressing its weight down onto the iron chassis with the force of a hydraulic press. The very air around it seemed to warp, shivering with the sheer, unnatural cold of an abyssal void that refused to be contained by mortal physics. "Step inside, Artie," the choir of voices rattled out from the dark interior of the cooler trays, their tone completely level and flat. Asterisk, "The fourth floor is dry. The circuit needs a ground. Complete the seam." Asterisk. "I ain't stepping into your vault," I wheezed, my lungs burning as the lack of oxygen began to turn the edges of my vision a blurry, vignette gray. I lunged to the side, my ruined boot giving out under my weight as I scrambled to get behind the heavy steel door of the cooler. I grabbed the inner handle, intending to slam the 4-inch insulated bulkhead shut and lock the entity inside the masonry before the gurney could bridge the gap. But the moment my fingers wrapped around the interior iron latch, the heavy oak doors at the far end of the hallway gave a concussive bang. A massive, pressurized column of white steam erupted from the main return pipe above the ramp, ripping the canvas insulation to shreds. The blast hit the corridor like a physical wall, throwing a dense, blinding sheet of silver fog between me and the gurney. Through the roaring mist, I felt a freezing, waxy grip close around the heel of my ruined boot. It wasn't a hand, boss. It was the loose, wet tail of the white cotton shroud, sliding out from beneath the gurney's frame like a living wire, wrapping itself around my ankle to drag me backward into the dark throat of the cooler. I felt my skin frost over where the fabric touched me, a necrotic chill that promised I'd never wake up from the pressure of that tomb. My heartbeat thundered against my ribs, a frantic, pathetic drumbeat against the absolute, crushing stillness of the vault. As I was pulled, I clawed at the concrete floor, my nails snapping and tearing until the grit under my skin felt like needles of glass. The darkness within the cooler wasn't just an absence of light, boss, it was a hungry, viscous presence that tasted of ancient ozone and stagnant water, pulsing in time with the faint, metallic grinding of the building's hidden gears. It felt as if the entire facility was nothing more than a rusted, dying clock, and I was the final cog being forced into the grinding machinery of a nightmare that had been waiting decades for me to arrive. I looked up one last time at the receding yellow light of the hallway, and then the heavy steel door slammed shut with a finality that shook the very foundations of the earth beneath us. The grip around my ankle didn't feel like flesh, boss, it felt like a band of frozen canvas that was tightening with the mechanical force of a motorized winch. The cold of that wet shroud sliced right through the leather of my boot, turning the skin of my heel numb within 3 seconds. I hit the concrete floor hard, my flashlight flying out of my hand and shattering against the base of the cooler wall, plunging the floorboards back into an absolute, suffocating blackness. The silver fog coming off the ruptured steam line was so dense I could taste the carbolic lime wash on the back of my tongue. I was being dragged backward, my denim trousers scraping against the dry concrete as the invisible force on the gurney pulled me toward the wide, open mouth of cooler number 3. "The line must ground, Artie," the voices from the interior trays hissed, no longer a choir now, but a high-pitched, pressurized whistle that sounded like steam escaping a cracked manifold. Asterisk, "You're the last valve. Let it drop." Asterisk. "Not tonight, you bastard," I choked out. My lungs were screaming for air in the vacuum, but I forced my arms out into the dark, my fingers clawing wildly at the wet concrete until my fingernails split against the rough seams. My left hand collided with the heavy iron wheel of the gurney itself as it rolled past me, its ungreased axle giving off that low, vibrating groan. I didn't try to pull my leg loose from the linen wire. I used my momentum to swing my torso around, wrapping both arms around the solid iron leg of the gurney chassis. Asterisk thump shuck. Thump shuck, asterisk. The dual-pulsed piston rhythm inside the iron frame exploded right next to my ear, the vibrations so violent they made my vision blur. The carriage was trying to force its way into the cooler vault, dragging me along with it, the iron brackets groaning as the structural metal began to twist under the competing pressures. I reached down into my tool belt with a numb, trembling right hand. My fingers closed around the handle of my heavy, 12-inch iron pipe wrench, the one the hospital issued for clearing the old radiator valves. I didn't strike the corpse's shroud, boss. I raised the heavy wrench in the dark and drove the solid iron head straight into the narrow clearance between the gurney's front left wheel and the concrete floorboards. Clang! The impact sent a shower of freezing blue sparks directly into my eyes, tasting like raw battery acid. The wrench jammed deep into the axle assembly, mechanically locking the caster wheel against the frame. The gurney gave a violent, jointed shudder. Without all four wheels turning, the carriage couldn't maintain its trajectory. The immense hydraulic force dragging it forward buckled under the sudden friction, and the entire 80-pound iron rig tipped sideways, slamming into the stainless steel frame of the cooler door with a concussive roar that shook the mortar out of the ceiling joists. The canvas loop around my ankle snapped with a dry, thread-snapping report. The vacuum inside cooler number 3 fractured instantly. A sudden, violent surge of pressurized air rushed out of the vault, hitting my chest like a physical fist and throwing me back against the opposite wall of the corridor. The silver-gray fluid climbing the masonry lost its tension, splashing back onto the floorboards like ordinary water as the circuit was violently, mechanically broken from below. The sudden loss of structural integrity felt like the building itself was exhaling a long, dying breath, the iron pipes in the walls groaning as they cooled and retracted, leaving me gasping on the wet floor in the sudden, eerie quiet. Every shadow in the hallway seemed to lengthen, retreating back into the dark seams of the walls like insects disturbed by a sudden light, leaving behind nothing but the faint, fading scent of burning ozone and that persistent, metallic tang of deep-sea rot. I sat there in the dark for a long moment, my hands shaking so violently I couldn't even stand, waiting for the floor to stop swaying like the deck of a ship adrift in a storm that no one else could feel, boss, just me and the ghost of a machine that wasn't ready to let me go. The concussive blow of that pressure drop didn't just break the circuit, boss, it felt like the entire concrete floor of Blackwood sub-basement had been kicked from below by a literal iron boot. The heavy gurney, now pinned sideways against the stainless steel frame of the cooler, gave a terrifying, metallic screech as the frame buckled under the sudden shift in gravity. The invisible weight that had been pressing down on the zinc table didn't just vanish, it was violently, magnetically sucked back down into the foundation, pulled by the immense, terrifying vacuum of the old 1940s plumbing loop beneath our feet. Asterisk thump shuck. Thump shuck, asterisk. The dual-pulsed piston rhythm inside the walls didn't stop, but the frequency changed. It went from a predatory, controlled mechanical cadence to a frantic, erratic stammer, the sound of an ancient engine whose main drive shaft had just snapped at 5,000 RPMs. With the gurney jammed against the door, the open vault of cooler number 3 acted as a massive, upside-down funnel. The air density inside the corridor shifted so fast my ears gave a sharp, bloody pop, and the thick, carbolic steam that had been rolling down from the ruptured pipe was suddenly dragged toward the refrigerator trays in a violent, swirling vortex. "Artie!" Uncle Silas's voice didn't rattle through the steam pipes anymore. It was a high, drilling shriek that echoed out from the dark, open drains inside the cooler walls. Asterisk, the manifold is splitting. The return line is dry. You're venting the main chamber. Asterisk. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I was pinned on my back against the damp concrete, my fingers clawing at the rough river stone baseboards to keep from being drawn into the black hole of the refrigerator vault. Through the silver-gray mist, I looked up. The flat, empty white sheet that had been sucked through the gurney's drainage slats was dropping back down. Without the vertical vacuum from the lower tanks to keep it suspended, the stiff, bleached cotton descended with a jerky, jointed deceleration, its fibers popping as it slammed back onto the zinc frame with a wet, heavy thud. But the entity inside the system wasn't done, boss. The long, broken strand of the shroud, the one that had wrapped around my ankle, was still whipping through the dark like a piece of live wire. The linen fibers had unraveled at the tip, forming dozens of tiny, gray tendrils that panted and twitched in the carbolic air. Driven by the dying vacuum, the thread made one final, desperate lunge through the dark, aiming straight for my exposed throat to force the loop closed before the pressure reached absolute zero. "No you don't," I wheezed. I raised my right arm, my muscles trembling so hard the bones felt like glass, and grabbed the long, rusted handle of the iron pipe wrench still wedged in the gurney's axle. I didn't pull it out, boss. I threw my entire weight downward, forcing the heavy iron tool to grind deeper into the steel gear assembly, bridging the gap between the frame of the carriage and the main iron water pipes that ran deep into the wet Illinois mud. A brilliant, blinding flash of blue static erupted from the metal surface, tasting like raw copper and battery acid on my tongue. The wire-like thread didn't just snap, it flared with a sharp, white phosphorescence and instantly disintegrated into a fine, harmless layer of gray soot that was swept straight down into the cooler trays. The choir of voices gave one collective, deafening gasp, a sound like a wet sheet being torn in half by a gale-force wind, and then, the roaring static in the walls died. The silence that returned to the sub-basement was immediate, heavy, and absolute, broken only by the steady, natural dripping of muddy groundwater from the main return valve over the coal bin. The gurney lay still against the cooler door, its frame bent and twisted, but quiet. The white sheet was just a white sheet again, draped loosely over the cold zinc. I lay there in the dark soot, my chest heaving as the clean, freezing rain from the county streets far above began to rattle against the high street-level vents, filling the void. The silence that followed was different from the quiet I was used to, boss. It wasn't the heavy, stagnant peace of a county morgue, it was the hollow, ringing silence that hits a factory floor after the main generators are suddenly cut off. The air density inside the corridor equalized with a final, low-frequency hum that vibrated the fillings in my teeth, leaving behind only the cold, sharp scent of an Illinois rainstorm. I lay on the wet concrete for what felt like hours, watching my own breath form slow, natural clouds that drifted up toward the ceiling pipes without being sucked into the dark. My left knee was a throbbing knot of white-hot pain, but the circulation was back. The administrative cold was receding. Slowly, using the buckled frame of the gurney for leverage, I dragged myself to my feet. The iron rig was ruined, its chassis twisted and its wheels locked at a permanent, jagged angle against the cooler door. But the tension was gone. When I reached out and pulled the white cotton shroud back over the zinc table, Donald Vance's body was back where it belonged. He lay flat, heavy, and marble gray. His jaw was closed, his eyes blank, no longer leaking that clear, phosphorescent silver fluid. Far below, in the deep black channels of the 1940s plumbing loop, I could hear the last of the steam condensing into ordinary water, draining out into the deep mud of the Blackwater ravine where the hospital grounds ended. The choir of souls wasn't screaming anymore. The pressure had dropped. The circuit was grounded. I grabbed the handle of my heavy iron pipe wrench, dislodging it from the mangled axle gear with a dull metallic clank, and slid it back into my tool belt. "The ledger is balanced, Vance," I whispered, my voice dry as paper in the empty hallway. I limped over to the adjacent holding cooler, cooler number 4, which was completely dry and silent. I threw the chrome lever, and this time, the heavy steel door swung open with nothing but a normal, ungreased groan. Working with my raw, bandaged hands, I dragged Donald Vance's cold, dead weight off the ruined gurney and slid his tray smoothly into the darkness of the vault. I slammed the 4-inch insulated bulkhead shut, locking the heavy chrome latch into place with a definitive, bureaucratic click. By the time I finished wiping the silver soot from my palms, a faint, dirty gray light began to bleed through the high, street-level coal vents at the top of the ramp. The storm outside had broken, leaving nothing but a steady, rhythmic drizzle against the mud. Upstairs, the heavy municipal lights gave a loud, sudden buzz hum as the hospital's auxiliary power grid finally reset itself. The overhead fluorescent tubes flickered, then caught, flooding the sub-basement corridor with a cold, sterile white light that washed out every crimson shadow in the brick corners. The heavy oak doors at the end of the hall gave a loud click as the brass deadbolt automatically disengaged, released by the return of the building's normal electrical currents. I walked toward the ramp, my ruined right boot dragging with a heavy, rhythmic scrape against the concrete. As I stepped through the doors and began the long climb back to the surface level, I stopped by the main steam return line. The circular brass pressure gauge was completely dead now. The needle had dropped all the way back to zero, resting flat against the metal pin. The glass face was still cracked from the pressure, but the frost was gone, replaced by a thin, ordinary layer of condensation that was slowly dripping down onto the floorboards. I stepped out into the morning air just as the clock tower struck 6. The day shift was rolling in, their cars splashing through the puddles in the gravel parking lot. But let me tell you something, boss, when you spend your nights pushing the dead through the veins of an old asylum, you learn that every building is just an engine built over a graveyard. Every corridor has a closed loop, a forgotten valve, or a hidden seam waiting under the concrete. And sooner or later, when the rain hits the right cadence and the pressure begins to build, the dark always finds a way back up.